Sign the papers, Evelyn. Don't be difficult. It's for the family's legacy, Eleanor whispered, her hand gripping my forearm with a strength that felt like a predator's claw. I looked her straight in the eye, my voice trembling with a rage I had to swallow. The legacy or your new lifestyle, Eleanor? Because I don't see Julian here to sign his own life away. Julian is busy securing our future, she snapped, her eyes flashing with a greed she couldn't hide anymore. Now, pick up the pen. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan Heritage Bank, blurring the city into a gray, distorted mess. Inside, the air was filtered and cold, smelling of expensive mahogany and old money. I stood there, clutching a designer briefcase containing $1.5 million in cold, hard cash, the blood and sweat of 5 years running a high-end architectural firm. Beside me, Eleanor, my mother-in-law, looked like a queen in her Chanel suit, but to me, she was starting to look more like a vulture. Evelyn, dear, she said, her voice dropping into that sickly sweet register that usually preceded a demand. Since we're setting up this high-yield trust, it's only logical to put it in my name. The tax benefits for seniors are astronomical compared to yours. We have to be smart. I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. Smart, Eleanor? Or invisible? This money belongs to the firm, to Julian and me. And what is Julian's is mine, and what is mine is his, she replied smoothly. Your family, Evelyn. Why are you acting like a stranger? We reached window 3. The teller, a woman around my age named Audrey, didn't look up immediately. She was focused on her screen, her fingers flying across the keys. Eleanor slammed the briefcase onto the marble counter. We're here for the private deposit, Eleanor announced. Audrey finally looked up. Our eyes met. For a split second, I saw a flicker of recognition. Audrey was the girl who had helped me through my business ethics course in college. But there was something else in her eyes. Panic. As Eleanor turned her head to faintly cough and complain about the bank's air conditioning, Audrey slid a small yellow Post-it note through the gap in the bulletproof glass. I palmed it instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Eleanor headed for the restroom, clutching her stomach. Watch the teller, Evelyn. Don't let her miscount a single cent. The moment she disappeared around the corner, I unfolded the note under the counter. Run. This account is a trap. Call the feds. My blood turned to ice. I looked at Audrey. She didn't say a word, but her gaze darted toward the exit. Every instinct I had, every ounce of the strong-willed woman my father had raised me to be, screamed at me to move. But I didn't just want to run. I wanted to burn their house of cards down. The 20 minutes felt like 20 years. We sat in the velvet-lined waiting area, the silence between us heavy enough to choke on. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check emails, but I was actually logging into my private cloud server, the one Julian didn't know exists. I began digging. If they were transferring $1.5 million today, they had to have been prepping the paperwork for weeks. I found it in a hidden subfolder labeled Garden Renovation. It wasn't sketches for a patio. It was a scanned copy of a power of attorney, my signature forged with terrifying precision. My hands trembled. The document gave Julian the right to sell our $4 million estate in the Hamptons, the 12-acre property my father had left to me. Is Julian joining us for lunch? I asked, my voice dripping with fake innocence. Eleanor checked her gold Rolex, the one I had bought her for her 70th birthday. He's tied up with a client. You know how hard he works to keep our lifestyle afloat. Our lifestyle? I countered. You mean the lifestyle my firm pays for? Eleanor leaned in close, Her perfume, something floral and expensive, cloying in my lungs. Listen to me, Evelyn. You were a girl from a blue-collar town who got lucky. Julian gave you a name. I gave you social standing. Don't let a little stress make you forget your place. My place. My place was at the head of the table, not under their boots. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check the driveway. 224 Maple Street. Hurry. 224 Maple Street. That was the address of a small boutique hotel Julian claimed he was consulting for. I need some air. I stood up abruptly. Evelyn, the bank. The money isn't going anywhere, Eleanor. I'll be back in 15 minutes. I left my migraines medication in the car. I didn't wait for her response. I bolted through the revolving doors into the New York rain. I hailed a cab, tossing a $50 bill at the driver. Maple Street, as fast as you can. As the cab swerved through traffic, I felt a transformation. The woman who stayed silent to keep the peace was dead. The woman who was about to take everything back was just waking up. When we pulled up to the hotel, I saw Julian's silver Porsche parked in the back alley. And there he was, stepping out of the side entrance. But he wasn't alone. He was holding the waist of a woman who looked 10 years younger than me, blonde, and wearing a coat that cost more than my first car. Scarlet. They weren't just consulting. They were laughing, sharing a kiss that felt like a knife in my gut. But it wasn't the kiss that broke me. It was the folder Julian handed her. It was the deed to my 12-acre estate. Happy early anniversary, baby, I heard him say as I rolled down the window slightly. Once the bank transfer clears this afternoon, Evelyn will be a ghost, and we'll be on a plane to Paris. I pulled my phone out and recorded every second of it. The betrayal was complete. The trap was set. Now it was my turn to play. The rain hammered against the roof of the taxi like 1,000 tiny drums, echoing the pounding in my chest. I watched the Porsche pull away, Julian's laughter still ringing in my ears like a death knell. He looked so happy, so carefree, as he handed over my inheritance to a woman who hadn't worked a day in her life. Driver, back to the bank, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. It was cold, devoid of the warmth that usually defined me. You okay, lady? You look like you've seen a ghost, the driver muttered, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. No, I replied, staring at the blurred lights of Manhattan. I just realized I've been living with ghosts for 7 years. It's time for an exorcism. I didn't call the police, not yet. If I called them now, the money would be frozen, the assets tied up in years of litigation, and Julian would find a way to spin it. No, I needed him to think he was winning. I needed him to commit the crime fully so I could bury him under it. When I walked back into the bank, Eleanor was pacing the marble floor, her face flushed with irritation. Where have you been? The manager is waiting in the private suite. You've wasted 20 minutes of our time, she hissed, grabbing my arm. I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. I didn't pull away. I leaned in, whispering, I forgot my medicine, Eleanor. But I feel much better now, clear-headed, sharp. She narrowed her eyes, sensing a shift in the atmosphere but unable to pin it down. Good, then let's sign. The $1.5 million needs to be moved before the clearinghouse closes at 4 p.m. We entered the suite. It was a soundproof room with heavy oak doors. Audrey was there, looking pale, standing next to a senior manager who looked like he was carved out of granite. Mrs. Sterling, the manager said, gesturing to a digital tablet on the desk. We have the transfer documents ready. To the Heritage Legacy Trust, as requested by your husband and mother-in-law. I sat down, crossing my legs slowly. I picked up the electronic pen. my hand didn't shake. "Wait," I said, pausing with the pen a millimeter above the screen. I noticed a discrepancy in the tax ID for the trust. "Eleanor, do you have the secondary filing papers? The ones Julian mentioned this morning?" Eleanor froze. I have them in my bag. Why?" "I just want to ensure the $1.5 million is protected from the state audit next month," I lied smoothly. "You know how the IRS loves to dig into legacy funds." The mention of the IRS worked like a charm. Greed is always accompanied by fear. "Of course. Let me find them," she said, rummaging through her Hermes bag. While her head was down, I glanced at Audrey. I slid my phone onto the table, the screen facing her. It showed a photo I had just taken of Julian and Scarlett at the hotel. Audrey's eyes nearly popped out of her head. I gave her a microscopic nod. "Oh, here they are," Eleanor chirped, pulling out a folder. I didn't even look at them. I signed the tablet, but I didn't sign my name. I signed a specific code, a distress signal I had set up with the bank's security department years ago when I first opened the firm's accounts. It looked like E. Sterling to the untrained eye, but the internal system would flag it as authorized under duress. "There," I said, standing up. "It's done." "Wonderful," Eleanor beamed, clutching the folder to her chest. "Now let's go. We have a big night ahead. Julian has a surprise for you at my 72nd birthday dinner tonight." "I'm sure he does," I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. "And I have a few surprises of my own. I hope you're prepared for a party the city will never forget." As we walked out, I caught Audrey's gaze one last time. She was already picking up the phone. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was wait for the explosion. The drive back to our estate in the Hamptons was a masterclass in deception. Eleanor chatted incessantly about the catering, the guest list, and how splendid it was to have the family's finances finally consolidated. I sat in the passenger seat of her Mercedes, watching the 12-acre landscape of my life flash by. Every tree, every stone path on this property had been chosen by me, and Julian thought he could hand it over to Scarlett with a kiss and a folder. "You're very quiet, Evelyn," Eleanor remarked, glancing at me. "Still thinking about that migraine?" No, Eleanor," I said, staring at the iron gates as they swung open. "I'm thinking about the birthday toast I'm going to give you tonight. It has to be perfect. 72 is such a monumental age." "It is, isn't it? A time for reflection?" she sighed, oblivious to the frost in my tone. The moment we entered the house, I headed straight for my home office. I locked the door. My heart was a frantic bird in a cage, but my mind was a cold, calculating machine. I had exactly 4 hours before the guests arrived. I opened my laptop and contacted my private investigator, Marcus. I had put him on a retainer months ago when I first noticed Julian's late nights becoming late weekends. "Marcus," I said when he picked up, "I need everything. The offshore account numbers, the flight manifest for Paris, and the footage of Julian at the boutique hotel today. I want it formatted into a presentation." "You've got it, Evelyn," Marcus's gravelly voice replied. "But there's more. I tracked the $1.5 million. The moment you signed at the bank, the funds moved to an intermediary account. It's headed for a bank in Zurich, not the Caymans. They're trying to bury it deeper than we thought." "Can you stop it?" I asked, my grip tightening on the desk. "I can't stop the transfer, but I can delay the final clearance by flagging it for an internal fraud review. It'll buy you 24 hours. After that, it's gone. That's all I need. Send the files to the encrypted drive I gave you. And Marcus, make sure the footage of Scarlett and Julian is high definition. I want everyone to see the legacy Julian is building." After hanging up, I spent the next 2 hours doing something I hadn't done in years. I looked through our wedding album. I looked at the man I thought I loved, a man who had promised to protect me. It was a painful reminder that the person I married was a ghost, a character played by a con artist. A knock at the door startled me. "Eve, you in there?" It was Julian. His voice was smooth, like expensive bourbon, but now it just made my skin crawl. I unlocked the door. He stood there, looking dashing in a tailored tuxedo, a glass of scotch in his hand. He stepped in and tried to kiss my cheek. I turned my head just enough so he hit my ear. "Rough day at the bank?" he asked, oblivious. "Mom said you were a bit difficult with the paperwork." "Just thorough, Julian. You know I like to see where every dollar goes," I said, walking past him to pick up my dress for the evening. A deep, blood-red silk gown. "Well, it's done now. We're set for life," he said, taking a sip of his drink. He leaned against my desk, the very place where he had probably forged my signature. "You look beautiful, by the way. Red is definitely your color tonight." "It's the color of power, Julian," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And tonight, I feel very powerful." He laughed, a rich, condescending sound. "That's my girl. Let's go. The guests are arriving. It's time to show the world what the Sterlings are made of." "Oh, I intend to, Julian," I whispered as he walked out. "I intend to show them exactly what you're made of." The week leading up to the gala was a masterclass in psychological warfare. To Julian and Eleanor, I was the perfect broken bird. I played my part to perfection, keeping my head down, speaking in hushed tones, and letting them see me accidentally leave my blueprints out. They thought I was losing my grip. In reality, I was tightening the noose. Every evening, Julian would return home, smelling of expensive cologne and the faint, lingering scent of Scarlett's perfume. He would press a kiss to my forehead with a tenderness that made my skin crawl. "You look tired, Eve," he'd say, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Don't worry. After the gala, the Paris trip will fix everything. You just need to rest and let me handle the business." I would just nod, my eyes fixed on the floor so he wouldn't see the fire burning in them. While he was out playing successful CEO with my money, I was spending my nights in the shadows with Marcus. We were building a digital fortress. We tracked every cent, every offshore wire transfer, and every forged signature Julian had used to bleed my company dry. The turning point came 48 hours before the event. Marcus called me, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. He had intercepted a decrypted email chain between Julian and Eleanor. "The villa in Paris is ready," Eleanor had written. "The local doctors are on the payroll. Once she's there, we'll trigger the medical emergency. A breakdown in a foreign country, far from her lawyers. The court will have no choice but to grant us total power of attorney. By the time she's better, there won't be a cent left in her name." I sat in my dark office, the blue light of the laptop screen reflecting in my eyes like cold steel. They weren't just trying to steal my company. They were planning to erase my existence. They wanted to gaslight me into a padded cell so they could live in luxury off my hard work. My hands shook. Not with fear, but with a crystalline, murderous fury. They thought they were the predators, but they had forgotten who had built the empire they were trying to steal. The day of the gala arrived. The Sterling estate was transformed into a sea of white lilies, silk drapes, and flowing champagne. Eleanor was in her glory, gliding through the gardens like a queen, barking orders at the catering staff. She wore a diamond necklace that I knew, for a fact, had been purchased with my company's emergency reserve fund. "Evelyn, darling," she said, cornering me near the marble fountain. She looked me up and down, her eyes sharp as glass. "You look fragile. Are you sure you're up for this tonight? I have some mild sedatives in my room if the crowd becomes too much for your condition." "I've never been clearer, Eleanor," I replied, adjusting the strap of my gown. I had intentionally chosen a dress of deep, blood-red silk. In a room full of people wearing sterling white and classic black, I was the one thing they couldn't ignore. I was the warning sign. Julian joined us, looking every bit the dashing air in his tuxedo. He reached for my hand, but I subtly shifted to pick up a glass of sparkling water. "Tonight is the beginning of a new era for the Sterlings, Eve," he whispered, his eyes gleaming with greed. "You have no idea, Julian," I said, catching Audrey's eye across the lawn. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The elite of Manhattan were beginning to arrive. Investors, socialites, and journalists. They all thought they were attending a celebration of a new real estate development. They had no idea they were walking into a courtroom. Hidden inside the digital presentation for the new project was a different set of slides, a chronological timeline of every forged document, every secret meeting with Scarlett, and the audio recordings of Eleanor and Julian planning my breakdown. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the estate, the air felt heavy, like the tension before a lightning strike. The stage was set. The architects of my ruin were smiling and clinking glasses, completely unaware that the house of cards they built on my back was about to be leveled to the ground. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, the kind of heavy, expectant quiet that precedes a natural disaster. I remained standing, my hand resting lightly on the stem of my wine glass. I could feel Julian's gaze on me, smug, paternalistic, and entirely convinced he was about to be lauded as the hero of the Sterling family. "When I first married Julian," I began, my voice clear and unwavering, "I believed that the Sterling name stood for something indestructible. I believed in the legacy that Eleanor speaks of so often. But today, I learned that a legacy isn't built on stone and mortar. It's built on paper. And as I found out at the bank this morning, paper can be burned." Eleanor's smile faltered. She leaned forward, her voice a sharp whisper. "Evelyn, dear, this isn't the time for a business lecture. Sit down and let's have dessert." "Oh, but the dessert is the best part, Eleanor," I replied, flashing a brilliant, jagged smile. I raised my left hand, signaling to Leo in the tech booth. The massive 4K screens on either side of the room flickered to life. The guests leaned in, expecting a montage of childhood photos or corporate milestones. Instead, the first image that appeared was a high-definition scan of the power of attorney Julian had forged. My signature was highlighted in red side by side with my actual signature from our marriage certificate. The word forgery flashed across the screen in bold white letters. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Julian's face went from tan to a sickly mottled gray. He tried to stand, but his knees seemed to fail him. "Eve, what is this? This isn't funny." "I'm not joking, Julian," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Keep watching. This is the part where the family trust gets interesting." The screen changed. It was the footage Marcus had captured just hours ago. There was Julian, standing in the rain at 224 Maple Street, pulling Scarlett into a deep, passionate kiss. The audio, captured by a long-range directional mic, was crystal clear. "Once the bank transfer clears this afternoon, Evelyn will be a ghost and will be on a plane to Paris." The room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the glasses. Scarlett, who had been sitting at a back table near the kitchen, stood up, her face a mask of terror. Julian looked at her, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You spied on me? He stammered, his voice cracking. I protected myself, Julian. I spat, the anger finally boiling over. While you were planning to leave me in the ruins, I was talking to Audrey at the bank. I was talking to the federal auditors. That $1.5 million you tried to move to Zurich? It didn't go to your shell company. It's currently sitting in a frozen account under the jurisdiction of the FBI for suspected money laundering and fraud. Eleanor let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her throat. Our money is frozen? It was never your money, Eleanor. I turned to her, my eyes burning with a cold fire. It was the company's capital, my company, the one you tried to steal while you were smiling at me across the dinner table. You didn't just want a legacy. You wanted a kingdom built on my bones. Julian finally found his feet, his face contorted with rage. He lunged toward me, but two men in suits, Marcus's associates, stepped out from the shadows of the pillars and intercepted him. Stay back, Julian, I said, picking up my glass and finally taking a sip of the vintage wine. The police are at the gates. I've handed over the forged deeds, the offshore account numbers, and the recordings of your little Paris planning session. I looked around the room at the elite of the city, the judges, the investors, the socialites. I hope you enjoyed the show. The Sterling legacy is officially over. But don't worry about the house. It won't be sold to Julian's mistress. It's being donated to a foundation for victims of financial abuse. I turned back to Julian, who was being pinned against the table by the security team. Happy birthday, Eleanor. And Julian, you were right about one thing. Red really is my color. I walked out of the ballroom, the sound of sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder with every step I took toward my new life. The sound of shattering glass echoed behind me as I stepped onto the terrace, but I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. I could envision the scene perfectly. Eleanor clutching her pearls as her social standing evaporated into the humid night air, and Julian, the man I once called my husband, realizing that the ghost had finally come back to haunt him. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to dance across the wet cobblestones of the driveway. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, turning the estate into a glistening, dark cage. Evelyn, wait! I stopped. I didn't want to, but the sheer desperation in Julian's voice was a melody I hadn't finished hearing yet. I turned slowly as he stumbled out of the French doors, followed closely by Marcus's security team. He looked pathetic. His tuxedo jacket was torn, his hair was matted with sweat, and the arrogance that had defined him for a decade was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. You can't do this, Eve, he panted, stopping a few feet away as the security guards barred his path. We're family. We can fix this. The $1.5 million. We can bring it back. I'll end it with Scarlett. I'll do whatever you want. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt a wave of profound disgust. Fix it, Julian? You didn't just break a vase. You tried to erase my life. You forged my name to sell my father's land, while you were sleeping with a woman you promised my money to. It was just business, he yelled, his voice cracking. The firm was struggling, and Mom said, "Stop blaming your mother." I cut him off, my voice a whip crack in the dark. You're a 33-year-old man who made a choice. You chose greed over loyalty. You chose a mistress over a partner. And now, you get to choose which lawyer is going to try to keep you out of federal prison. From inside the ballroom, I heard Eleanor's shrill voice screaming at the officers. Do you know who I am? I am Eleanor Sterling. This is a mistake. My daughter-in-law is insane. I looked past Julian at the grand house. She still thinks her name carries weight. She doesn't realize that by tomorrow morning, the Sterling name will be synonymous with fraud in every newspaper from Manhattan to Montauk. Evelyn, please, Julian whispered, sinking to his knees on the wet stone. I have nothing else. If the accounts are frozen and the house is gone, I have nothing. You have exactly what you gave me, Julian, I said, leaning down so my face was inches from his. Ruins. But unlike you, I know how to build something from the ground up. You only know how to tear things down. 2 uniformed officers approached, their heavy boots thudding on the terrace. One of them, a stern-looking woman with a silver badge, looked at me. Mrs. Sterling? We have the warrant for Julian Sterling and Eleanor Sterling regarding the forgery and attempted embezzlement of Manhattan Heritage Bank funds. He's all yours, officer, I said, stepping aside. As they pulled him up and clicked the cold steel of the handcuffs around his wrists, Julian looked at me one last time. There was no love in his eyes, only a flickering, dying ember of the man I thought I knew. I watched them lead him away, his knees dragging slightly on the ground. I stood there alone for a moment, the cold rain soaking into my red silk dress. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months was finally gone, but in its place was a vast, echoing hollow. I had won. I had kept the $1.5 million estate, the 12-acre estate, and my dignity. But as I watched the tail lights of the police cars disappear down the long driveway, I realized that the hardest part was just beginning. I had destroyed the architects of my misery. Now, I had to figure out how to live in the space they left behind. The morning after the storm was unnervingly quiet. The police tape had been cleared. The caterers had packed away the remains of the untouched lobster thermidor, and the guests, the friends who had basked in the sterling glow, had vanished like smoke. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, the same seat Eleanor had occupied just 12 hours ago. In front of me sat a single cup of black coffee and a thick stack of legal documents delivered by courier at dawn. The house felt like a tomb. Without the laughter, the clinking of crystal, and the rhythmic sound of Julian's lies, the walls seemed to close in. A soft knock at the front door broke the silence. It was Audrey, the bank teller. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but she was holding a small box. I had sent a car for her. She was the only person in this city I felt I could look at without seeing a double cross. They fired me, Evelyn, she said as she walked in, her voice small. The bank, they said I violated protocol by passing you that note. Even though it saved the assets, they can't have tellers interfering with client transactions. I stood up and walked toward her, taking the box from her hands. Let them fire you, Audrey. You're overqualified to be a teller anyway. I handed her an envelope from the table. This is your severance. It's 6 months' salary plus a contract. My firm needs a new chief financial officer, someone who actually knows how to spot a rat. Audrey stared at the envelope, then at me. You're keeping the firm open? After everything the papers are saying? The papers are talking about the Sterlings, I said, my voice hardening. My name is Evelyn Vance. That was the name on the original permits for this company, and that's the name that's going to be on the masthead tomorrow. I'm not letting their crimes bury my work. We spent the afternoon in my office, going through the wreckage. It was worse than I thought. Julian hadn't just tried to steal the $1.5 million. He had taken out secondary mortgages on the estate and used the company's credit lines to fund Scarlett's lifestyle. He was hemorrhaging cash, Evelyn, Audrey muttered, pointing to a series of wire transfers. Jewelry, A condo in Miami? A Porsche? He wasn't just planning to leave. He was trying to bankrupt you so you couldn't afford to sue him. A surge of that familiar, hot rage bubbled up in my throat. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the 12 acres of land. My land. Where is he now? I asked. The jailhouse. Eleanor's lawyer managed to get her out on bail due to health concerns, but Julian's being held. The feds found the offshore link to the Zurich account. They think he's a flight risk. Good, I whispered. Let him sit in a cage and think about the jet he missed. Suddenly my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Evelyn, please. It was Eleanor. Her voice was no longer the sharp, commanding trill of a socialite. She sounded old. She sounded broken. Julian is falling apart. They won't let him have his medication. If you just drop the forgery charge, we can settle the rest privately. Think of the scandal, Evelyn. Your reputation will be ruined along with ours. My reputation is built on my blueprints, Eleanor. Yours was built on a lie, I replied, my voice devoid of any mercy. And as for Julian, tell him to get used to the cold. I'm sure Scarlett will send him a postcard from wherever she's hiding with the pennies I left her. You heartless bitch! Eleanor screamed, the facade finally cracking completely. We made you! You were nothing before you married into this family! No, Eleanor, I said, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I was the foundation. You were just the dry rot in the attic, and today, I finally cleared the house. I hung up and blocked the number. I looked at Audrey, who was watching me with a mixture of awe and fear. What now? She asked. Now, I said, picking up a pen and signing the first of the new contracts. We rebuild, but this time, I'm the only one with the keys to the vault. The legal battle that followed was not a sprint. It was a grueling marathon through the mud. For weeks, the halls of the Manhattan Heritage Bank and the federal courthouse became my second home. Every morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., the silence of the 12-acre estate serving as a cold reminder of the war I was winning. I had successfully filed for an annulment based on fraud, a move that would legally strip Julian of any claim to my assets as if our marriage had never existed. But the ghosts weren't finished with me yet. One rainy Tuesday, a week before the final hearing, I received a visitor at the firm's new downtown office. I expected a process server or a journalist. Instead, I found Scarlett sitting in my lobby. She looked different without the designer coat and the arrogant smirk I'd seen in the rain. Her blonde hair was flat, and her eyes were shadowed with the kind of frantic energy that comes from realizing the ship you jumped onto is currently at the bottom of the ocean. I have 5 minutes, Scarlett, I said, not inviting her into my inner office. I stood by the glass door, my arms crossed. Make them count. Julian is going to turn on me, isn't he? She asked, her voice trembling. His lawyers are trying to say I was the mastermind, that I coerced him into the forgery. Evelyn, I didn't know he was stealing your money. He told me it was his inheritance. He told me you were an abusive alcoholic who was keeping him hostage for his name. I almost laughed. The irony was rich. He's a con artist, Scarlett. He tells everyone exactly what they need to hear to get what he wants. To me, he was the loyal husband. To you, he was the victim. In reality, he's just a thief. I have recordings, she whispered, leaning in, of him and Eleanor. They talked about liquidating the asset. That's what they called you. They planned to have you committed to a psychiatric facility after the Paris trip, so you couldn't contest the transfers. Eleanor had a doctor on the payroll ready to sign the papers. The air left my lungs for a second. I had known they were greedy, but this was a level of depravity that chilled me to the bone. They hadn't just wanted my money, they wanted my mind. They wanted me locked away in a white room while they spent my life's work on the Champs-Élysées. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked, my voice tight. "Because the feds are coming for me too," she admitted, a tear finally escaping. "If I give you the evidence to bury them for good, will you tell the prosecutor I cooperated? I don't want to go to prison for a man who's already trying to sell me out to save his own skin." I looked at her, this woman who had participated in the destruction of my heart, and I saw a mirror. Not of myself, but of the woman I might have become if I hadn't fought back. She was a pawn that Julian had used and discarded, just like he tried to do to me. "Give me the recordings," I said. "If they are what you say they are, I'll have my lawyers talk to the district attorney. But if you're lying to me, Scarlett, I will make sure you're in the cell right next to his." She handed over a small digital recorder, her hand shaking. As she hurried out of the office, I felt a strange sense of closure. The circle was closing. That evening, I sat in my study and played the files, hearing Eleanor's voice, cold, calculating, discussing my institutionalization as if they were talking about a kitchen renovation, erased the last shred of hesitation in my soul. I had felt a tiny flicker of guilt for leaving a 72-year-old woman to face the law, but listening to her laugh about drugging my evening tea extinguished that flame forever. I picked up the phone and called Marcus, my investigator. "Marcus, it's me. I have the final nail. We're not just going for embezzlement and forgery anymore," I said, staring at the blueprints on my desk. "We're going for conspiracy to kidnap and aggravated fraud. I want Julian and Eleanor to hear the cell doors lock before the end of the month." "Consider it done, Evelyn," he replied. "By the way, how are you holding up?" I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. For the first time in months, I didn't see a victim. I didn't even see the Ice Queen. I saw an architect. "I'm fine, Marcus," I said. "I'm just realizing that the best way to deal with ghosts is to build something so big they don't have anywhere left to hide." The morning of the final sentencing arrived with a crisp, clear sky, the kind of blue that feels like a fresh start. I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom, draped in a tailored charcoal suit. No more blood-red silk. I didn't need the color of war anymore. I was here for the peace that comes with justice. To my left sat Audrey, now officially the CFO of Vance Architectural Group. To my right, Marcus, the man who had helped me dig through the lies. The side door opened, and the bailiff called the court to order. Then came the defendants. Julian was first. He had lost weight, his skin sallow and his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. Gone was the Porsche-driving playboy. In his place was a broken man in a cheap suit. Behind him, Eleanor was led in. She tried to maintain her regal posture, but her hands were trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists. The judge, a formidable woman named Sarah Jenkins, didn't waste time. She looked at the mountain of evidence, the banknotes, the forged deeds, the recordings Scarlett had provided, and the financial trail of breadcrumbs Julian had left across the Atlantic. "Julian Sterling," Judge Jenkins began, her voice echoing in the hallowed hall. "You didn't just commit financial fraud. You attempted to systematically dismantle a human being's life for your own vanity. The evidence of your plan to institutionalize your wife while draining her accounts is among the most predatory I have seen in 20 years on this bench." Julian looked at me, his mouth trembling. Evelyn, please, he mouthed. I didn't blink. I watched him the way an architect watches a condemned building being raised. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12, the judge declared. The gavel struck the wood like a gunshot. Eleanor let out a sharp, choked sob. When it was her turn, the judge showed little more mercy. Eleanor Sterling, for your role in the conspiracy and the forgery, and despite your age, you are sentenced to 7 years. Your legacy, madam, is one of shame. As the guards moved in to lead them away, Eleanor turned toward me, her face contorted in a final ugly mask of rage. You think you've won? You're alone, Evelyn. You have all that money and no one to share it with. You're nothing but a cold, lonely stone. I stood up slowly as they dragged her toward the holding cells. The room was silent. I waited until she was nearly at the door before I spoke. I'm not alone, Eleanor, I said, my voice steady and echoing. I'm finally at peace, and the stone you're talking about? That's the foundation. Something you wouldn't know anything about. 3 months later, the 12-acre estate was finally quiet. But it wasn't the silence of a tomb anymore. It was the silence of a construction site on a Sunday. I had kept the land, but I had demolished the old Sterling mansion, the house of lies. In its place, the steel beams of the Vance sanctuary were rising. It was to be a state-of-the-art center for women who had been victims of domestic and financial abuse, a place where they could find the legal and emotional architecture to rebuild their lives. I stood on the edge of the property, looking out at the Atlantic. The $1.5 million from the bank had been fully recovered, and with the civil suit settlements, I had more than enough to fund the center for decades. My phone buzzed. A text from Audrey. First 3 contracts for the New City Library project just cleared. We're overbooked, boss. I smiled and tucked the phone away. I thought back to that rainy day at the bank, to the terrifying moment Audrey slid that yellow note across the counter. I thought about the woman in the red dress who had stood at that dinner table, ready to burn it all down. I wasn't that woman anymore. The anger had been a useful tool, but I didn't need to carry it like a shield every day. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. For the first time in 7 years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I had built a life that Julian and Eleanor couldn't touch. I had designed a future where I was the sole architect, and as the wind blew off the ocean, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings, I realized that the best revenge wasn't just winning. It was moving on so completely that the ghosts didn't even have a name anymore. I turned my back on the ocean and walked toward the rising steel of my new building. There was work to do. Trust is good, but keeping yourself safe is better. Always stay sharp, especially with your heart and your money. The best revenge isn't anger. It's building a successful life that you own completely. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.